Welcome back, everyone. It's our last session for today is by Jamey Swigert, the Director of AV Sales and Business Development at Pandrit. He'll be talking about the impact on our offices and schools from an AV perspective. Jamey is responsible for strategy development and go-to-market planning and sales in the AV market. Jamey holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from the College of Charleston and a master's degree in international business studies from the University of South Carolina. We also have on this session, pleased to announce that Laura, a talented scriber, will be drawing while Jamey talks and gives his presentation as well. Thank you, and Jamey, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. All right, so hopefully everybody can now see Laura's screen. We've done the magic right here. There we go. Looks like we've got it working. All right. Well, good morning, or from Chicago, good afternoon, where you are, or wherever you may be. As Steve said, I'm going to talk a little bit today about 2020, the impacts that it has had on the AV industry, as well as sort of our general professional lives, and maybe more importantly, what that may mean in the long term. What effects from 2020 might we see a decade from now, and how might life change a little bit? So it's certainly an understatement to say that 2020 has been a very difficult year, a year of personal difficulty in our lives, as well as professional challenges in how we work and where we work. Statistics say that pretty much everybody on this call has known somebody that has contracted COVID. Some of you may have even had it yourselves and recovered. And unfortunately, some people may know somebody that has died from COVID. But outside of the human tragedy, the impact of COVID on our professional lives has likely been, similar probably for all of us. We've sort of been suddenly thrust into a work from home mode. When the lockdowns in the United States started, I was actually attending a Panduit event in Mexico, in Latin America. When I left the United States to go to Mexico, we were working out of an office, and when I returned, nobody was working out of an office. Our students have had probably an even more difficult experience. I have two young boys, 10 and 13 years old, and they had never learned virtually before. So they had to learn how to learn virtually with the tools that they had, just as I did in returning and working out of a home office. So it's certainly been challenging, but if we step back from our personal trials this year and look at 2020 in the longer lens of sort of historical perspective, we could look back at 2020 as a year that was an engine of great change, because 2020 is a year of disruption, certainly both professionally and personally. And working in the tech industry, we know that disruption opens the door to great possibilities and to opportunity. We're all involved in tech in some way, and so I'm sure everybody's aware that new technology can certainly be disruptive to markets, right? So if we think way back to the development of the transistor and the integrated circuit, which led to personal computing and eventually the internet, which now affects our lives in so many different ways. Applications of technology can disrupt markets as well. If we think about ride-sharing services, initially they certainly disrupted the taxi industry, but now they're even become so prevalent that they're disrupting public transportation, as well as even sales of new automobiles. But disruption can also come from larger world events. If you think about World War II, that led to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, which eventually led to the space race. Putting men into space created so much technology that we probably just take it for granted today, from things as simple as Velcro to satellites, which provide GPS. That's sort of integral into everything we do now. And more recently leading to low Earth orbit satellites that promise to bring internet to places on the globe where it's never been feasible to bring wired internet before, and could dramatically impact economic development in places like sub-Saharan Africa, which could literally change the face of the world and change people's lives. So obviously disruption leads to change, which leads to opportunity. And so today I'm going to review the impacts that the AV market has experienced this year. And then I'll theorize a little bit about what some of the longer term impacts may be for both AV technology and our work life in general. So looking back at the year, we've seen businesses of all types in the AV industry struggle. We've seen demand disappear in some sectors. We've seen supply chains disrupted, businesses hanging on to employees or fighting to hang on to employees. We've sort of lived a roller coaster this year, periods of very, very slow sales, periods of frenzied business activity. So as one example, the sector of the AV market called live event production is dead, right? Live event production is things like concerts, large conferences, public presentations. Those companies carry millions of dollars of inventory of high-tech equipment, from lighting to soundboards to microphones, and with all sort of in-person events being canceled for most of the year, that sector of the market has obviously suffered greatly. In the supply chain, I think nearly everybody that manufactures and sells AV equipment has been affected to some degree or another. Particularly because the AV industry, like many products, is really dependent on a global supply chain. And factories around the world have been affected at different times to different degrees by national and local regulations. The number of people working in factories has fluctuated as waves of the COVID virus have affected regions, either locking down workers to not go to the factory, or factory workers getting sick or exposed and needing to quarantine at home. And so production capacity has been fluctuating significantly. Even companies like Panduit, that manufacture their own products, have been affected because we're dependent on raw materials or components that are made by other companies in other parts of the world. As an example, we have two products at Atlona. They're probably about $1,000 product. We are currently on a long lead time for them because of a $2 chip that's manufactured in Asia from a factory that has been greatly affected. And so we're feeling impacts on the other side of the world, which trickles down to our distributors, to our integrators, and to the end customers who are waiting on the equipment to arrive and be installed. Additionally, we've seen air freight costs increase dramatically this year, and that's due to many fewer planes flying. I personally was not aware of how much freight or cargo is carried in the bottom of passenger airplanes. And with hundreds and thousands of planes being grounded due to lack of demand, there's just not as many planes flying freight around the world. So the cost has increased about fivefold this year. In addition, the ocean freight, which has been less significantly impacted from a supply standpoint, but because of the overage of demand that airplanes are not flying, costs from ocean freight have gone up about 25% this year. And then finally, the time needed to clear customs once that plane or ship arrives in a port or an airport has increased because there's fewer people working at customs, and they're experiencing the same disruptions to their workforce as the plants that I described. So what might all these impacts bring to global supply chains, whether it's in the AV industry or someplace else? Well, certainly I think a lot of companies will be reevaluating their supply chain and perhaps making decisions about where to put factories, where to manufacture product, where to source products, perhaps bringing on additional suppliers or raw materials or components so that they're not wholly dependent on one manufacturing partner in one part of the world. And that could lead to a growth of centers of excellence for manufacturing. So if you think about Asia, where many, or probably a large majority of the world's electronics are manufactured, might we see centers of production sprouting up in Europe or Latin America in order to fulfill the demand that we may have for more localized production in theater? But it hasn't been all bad news this year. There's been a lot of business in the AV sector that has benefited. So for instance, the education market for AV had a very, very strong summer this year as schools rushed to equip classrooms for either virtual or hybrid in-person and virtual learning. Camera manufacturers, as you might expect, have had an incredible year. The major camera brands, in many cases, their most popular products are sold out and have lead times in months, 6 months to a year in some cases. And of course, video conferencing services or codecs have exploded greatly. At the end of last year, quarterly revenue of Zoom was somewhere around $106 million. And today it's sitting at about $188 million a quarter. So certainly there have been winners as much as there have been losers this year in the AV market. In terms of the changes that we've seen for AV installations and AV applications this year, we've certainly seen the manufacturers, including the company I work for at Lona, sort of responding to the need for more socially distanced meetings, the desire for employees or people utilizing AV to touch fewer surfaces. So things like being able to scan a QR code on a display and then having that QR code activate a control application or control page on your tablet, on your smartphone, so that you're no longer having to touch the tablet that's in the room. Devices that utilize capabilities like automatic display control and auto input selection have exploded in popularity. Automatic display control is when as soon as I plug, say, my laptop into a system, the display recognizes that there's a new source, it turns itself on, and then will turn itself off once I disconnect. Auto input selection means if I have multiple inputs on a conference room table, the first person to plug in gets the display or the TV. If somebody else comes in and plugs in or connects, then the system will automatically switch to the second input, and vice versa when somebody disconnects. The concept of soft codec conferencing as opposed to hard codec conferencing has become even more important. So soft codec conferencing is the use of software running on a laptop to launch a video conference, as opposed to hard codec conferencing, which requires dedicated hardware or a PC or a NOC or something in the room to run a particular platform. And the reason that soft codec conferencing has become so important this year is not everybody uses Teams or not everybody uses Zoom. I may use Teams as my standard, but certainly during the week, I talk to people using Zoom or Uber Conference or BlueJeans or WebEx, and I need the flexibility of a soft codec running software on my laptop in order to be able to connect to all those different services. And then finally, something called Byod Conferencing has become very popular, more important, more popular this year. That's the ability to connect to a system no matter what device I may have. So whether I have a MacBook from Apple or a Chrome tablet or a Windows 10 computer, the ability to connect seamlessly using those devices is becoming more and more important as people no longer want to touch a room PC, keyboard, and mouse and prefer to use their own devices. Likewise, our schools and universities are changing and adopting new technology and ways to deliver their product, their instruction. This started in the university systems probably about a decade ago as the idea of remote learning started to emerge, which of course at first was students going to a satellite campus of a university and sitting in a large room and watching an image and listening to a professor that might be at the main university. That slowly transitioned over to students, working from home on a laptop and doing the same and watching their professor. But that model, while it may seem like it would adapt very well to the COVID environment this year, has, I think pointed out some flaws in it. So if you think about a professor in a lecture hall today teaching to all remote students, they're sitting in a humongous room talking to a camera, which is, first kind of a ridiculous use of space. And so what I think we may see in the future is universities that build out facilities that are sort of custom designed for a 100% hybrid environment. So instead of a professor going into a large room and talking to a camera, perhaps they go into something more similar to an office size, so 3, 4, 5 square meters, where there's nothing but a wall full of monitors, displays, so that they can see their students and something other than a small postage-sized square on a laptop screen. They'll have their collaboration technology, high quality cameras, good microphones and speakers so that they can really interact with their students. Okay, so outside of the corporate and education environment, I wanted to talk a little bit about what our lives might be like, and what long-term impacts this idea of being able to work remote more effectively might mean for us. So pretty well since the time of the Industrial Revolution, we as people, our homes, our decisions on where to live have been tied to where our job is, right? If I'm an accountant, I'm going to live where I can get an accounting job. If I'm a welder, I'm going to live where I can find a welding job. You work for a company, and the company has decided where they have a headquarters office, where they may have a satellite office, and you're going to live near that office. Personally, about 6 years ago, when I started working at Panduit, accepted a job, I moved my family with my 2 young boys about 900 miles to a new city. I left behind my family and friends. Will I need to move again if I decide to change jobs at some point in the future? I think probably not. I think the chances are that I can live where I want to live. We've seen this year some very large tech companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, letting their employees know, or at least some of their employees know, that they no longer have to report to the office ever, that they can choose to live wherever they want to live. So what happens when people no longer live somewhere just because that's where their employer has an office? When I can live where I want to live rather than where my employer decides their office is. So I think what is probably a logical expectation is we may see people leaving large cities. Large cities typically have a higher cost of living, particularly when it comes to housing and things like groceries. They tend to have a lot of traffic. So if I had the option to either stay in the big city where my job has been, or to move, say, to the beach, what's going to keep me living in that large city? If I want to stick my toes in the sand and respond to emails, live in a larger house, pay less for groceries, I think it could end up meaning a very large shift in residential patterns, right? People leaving the larger cities and moving to smaller cities, which obviously could have big ripple effects on both local economies as well as national economies. I also think we're likely to see co-working spaces increase in popularity. If I'm responding to those emails from the beach with my toes in the sand, there will still be a time where I need office space, and maybe it's to meet face-to-face with people, or perhaps I just need that more sophisticated AV system that's in a co-working space as opposed to my home office. And corporate offices probably won't go away completely, but they're certainly, I think, going to change, and we're already seeing that today. Many organizations, companies that are looking at building new office space are strongly considering the idea of hot desking, where I no longer have a cubicle or office that's designated and reserved for me, but I might come into the office in the morning, log in, and the system will tell me where to go and sit. And those decisions are tied to creating enough personal space so that we're socially distanced. And they're probably tied to things like cleaning services, so that the cleaner at the end of the day knows what cubicles have been occupied and which ones haven't. And then sort of looking at this on a larger macro level, right, we can extend this idea of working from wherever to think that, in the future, I as an American may have more opportunity to work for companies that are not based or not have offices in the United States. If we can work anywhere, if I can work from down the street remotely, I can certainly work internationally remotely. That could have dramatic impacts on nations' tax laws and economic development incentives to attract and accommodate sort of a new employment model. So places that today, like the Netherlands and Dubai, that attract a lot of foreign nationals to live and work through their tax policies and economic policies, could find themselves at a significant global economic advantage if that sort of more interconnected global workforce comes to be. But the trend of, if we believe that the trend of people working out of a home office is not going to end just because the pandemic is gone, what changes might we see in our home office technology? when the lockdown started in the US, as I said, I was in Mexico. When I came home and had to work out of my home office, excuse me, all I had on me was a laptop and a wireless mouse. So far this year, I've added a docking station for my laptop. I've added 2 monitors so that I have more screen real estate. And then I moved my monitors and wall mounted them so that I could free up space on my desk, right? Atlona sells a nice video conferencing camera, so I upgraded that from my like 8-year-old 480p camera to a nice 1080p PTZ camera. And now I'm looking at better audio products. I like a better microphone, perhaps some higher fidelity speakers. And while all of these upgrades have definitely made my office more functional and improve the quality of my video conferencing, there's sort of diminishing returns when it comes to improving our hardware, because no matter how great my camera is or how great your display is, as soon as I connect via Teams or Zoom or any other conferencing codec, the image quality and even the audio is immediately compressed and downgraded. And in many cases, the conferencing codecs don't allow us to control that. They're simply optimizing the connection and the video quality for the amount of bandwidth that's available. So surely, if we're going to be working from home on a more permanent basis, I think this experience in terms of the fidelity of the audio and video signals has to improve. So if you think about somebody like Greg, our keynote speaker, he makes his living, aside from being an editor at Wired Magazine, from being a public speaker. I'm sure he puts many hours into developing his presentations, honing his speech, making sure that he's impactful as a speaker. And so why wouldn't somebody like Greg want to have a service where his image, his content, and the sound of his voice were delivered in the highest fidelity possible? So what might that service look like? Maybe it's something offered by an internet service provider. But of course, the improved connection can't just be from Greg's home office out to the internet. It has to extend to everybody that's viewing as well. So maybe it's something that the next great servicing conferencing software creates, excuse me. One that when participants connect to something akin to a VPN tunnel creates a prioritized connection so that the audio and video signals are of higher fidelity and higher resolution, or perhaps some combination of the two. But what about our office hardware, the cameras and the microphones? I think certainly there's a lot of room for improvement that we can sort of look forward to and think that might occur. So to me, anything that gets us closer to that experience of being in person with other people in a room is probably where we should be focusing. So if we think about, excuse me, sorry, a little technical difficulty here. If we think about an in-person environment, what might that look like? If I'm in a conference room in an office and somebody to the left of me speaks, I'm going to turn my head to look at that person, and I'm going to hear the sound coming from that area. Of course, when I'm on a video conference, everything is straight ahead of me and the sound is originating from wherever my speaker is. So one can imagine some improvements in oral capabilities, technology to pinpoint the sound of a speaker to certain places in front of me or around me, so that if Greg is talking to me, his voice is coming from here, and if Brett, our prior speaker, is speaking, that he's coming from here, and so forth. And that perhaps virtual reality can play a role in this, where I can visualize everybody from left to right in certain positions, rather than everybody just being a square on a rectangular monitor, so to speak. So I think there's a lot of areas for improvement, again, to sort of get us closer to replicating that concept of being in a room with people and having a more natural experience. Finally, I wanted to get to, I apologize, I'm having some issues with my computer here. The last thing that I think is going to be tied to all of this, whether it's the work from home experience today or what we may expect to see in the coming years, is IT departments at companies are going to be struggling to manage and maintain all this AV equipment, as well as computer equipment in home offices, right? If everybody's going out and buying their own cameras and their own microphones and their own displays and something goes wrong, it's going to be quite a headache for an IT help desk to be able to manage all of that. So what that might that mean for the AV industry going forward? Will IT departments or corporations turn to AV as a service? AV as a service is essentially a way of outsourcing the AV. So a company would contract with an integrator who would supply, install, maintain, and troubleshoot any of the AV equipment as experts. And of course, I think we can certainly anticipate that corporations would standardize on the hardware and software that's being used in their employees' home offices. And then finally, for AV manufacturers like Atlona, this may be something that eventually pushes the AV industry to reach a much higher degree of standardization in the way that the AV components work, particularly two different brands of AV equipment and the way that they integrate and operate and talk and work with each other. So I've presented a lot of ideas today on what the future of our work life might look like and how AV may play a role in that. Am I right? I don't know. I'm probably not any smarter than any of you out there watching me on this video conference with my highly compressed face on your monitor. But I think we can all agree that 2020 has been a year of disruption. That disruption leads to innovation, and that innovation provides opportunities. So in the future, the impacts of 2020, I think, will extend greatly into our lives. There's going to be winners, there's going to be losers, but I think certainly the world in 10 years will look much different than it does today. So thank you, and thank you very much to Laura for doing a great job of illustrating my presentation today. And I'm open for any questions, if there might be any questions.
Great, thank you, Jamey. Thank you for very valuable information. And Laura, again, thank you for illustrating the presentation. Just one quick question, and I think you just touched on it slightly, maybe you could just expand. You know, what do you see the role of artificial intelligence play in the AV in the future?
Yeah, I will confess I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence, but I think certainly there's a role for it. And I think we're starting to see it today, whether it's artificial intelligence or simply better engineered systems and software. You know, the thing I was speaking about towards the end about having a more natural conferencing experience, I think is an area where artificial intelligence and its offshoots can certainly help. One thing we're seeing today is the personal assistants like Siri or Alexa are beginning to be incorporated into AV systems. And sorry, now Alexa is talking to me because I mentioned her name. You know, instead of having to go in a conference room and plug wires in and change things on a control panel to make things work, I can simply ask my personal assistant to connect me to the display in the room to simplify the operation of the AV system. I think there's opportunities to make the software side of conferencing a lot more intuitive. Some of you may have seen me shifting things around on my monitor as I'm trying to find the right button to either share content or not share content, or to check a chat screen. And I think artificial intelligence can improve that entire experience for us and make it a lot more seamless and intuitive.
Fantastic, Jamey, just on time. So just in finishing, just a few final announcements from my side. Finally, come to the end of our TridentTech and who's shaping the future. We want to, again, on behalf of everyone, thank our speakers for the interesting talks, and hopefully it was beneficial for everybody. The platform will be open for the coming 30 days. Please feel free to book meetings with our team, download assets, and get back to watch the recorded sessions. You can also stay on to join our sponsor and our exhibitors in the networking lounge. They're sitting there on virtual tables in the lounge and ready to answer any of your questions live. However, it is important that you refresh your pages to make sure you can access the lounge. So the lounge is now open. And again, thank you for everyone for your attendance. Looking forward to having you at our next upcoming TridentTech editions. If you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. So thank you, stay safe, stay well, and thank you everyone again. Thank you.